So this video begins on page 43 in my copy of A Doll's House. So immediately after Dr. Rank has left, and we're now left for the moment with Nora and the maid, and in a second she'll be speaking to Krogstad. But first, a word or two about the structure. Now, if you recall from the notes which you made on the form of the play, you'll remember how the structure for most plays in the 19th century was just very simple. The genre that they call the well-made play. It's very simple: situation, complication, resolution. Now, if you think about it, thus far the play seems to have fallen into that pattern. The situation, we have Nora and her household. The complication, we learn about her history with the forgery to the loan when she forged her father's signature. And at the moment it seems for all the world as if she is looking for a way out of that, looking for a means of resolving it. We thought perhaps in the last scene that maybe she was going to ask Dr. Rank for help. She doesn't do that. At the moment it seems like she's still looking. So let's then continue and let's see where we go from here. So Nora speaks to the maid, where about halfway down my page that you can see here, and says, and he is standing waiting in the kitchen. Again, there's some dramatic irony, but we can all guess that it's Krogstad that we're talking about. And notice previously he came boldly to the front door. Now he's coming sort of almost surreptitiously or sneakily to the back door, to the kitchen entrance. The maid says, yes, he came up the back stairs. But you didn't tell him no one was in? Yes, but it was no good. So in other words, Krogstad has almost forced his way into the house. Nora says he won't go away? No, he says he won't go until he has seen you, Mom. Well, let him come in, but quietly. Helen, you mustn't say anything about it to anyone. It's a surprise for my husband. Notice again, we talked about the structure of this play in terms of the deceits that Nora practices. It starts out innocently enough with the little thing of hiding sweets, but by now she's on to really quite large-scale untruths, large-scale deceptions. The maid says, yes, Ma'am, I quite understand, and leaves. And again, we have another of these very brief but very telling soliloquies here. Nora, who says, this dreadful thing is going to happen. It will happen in spite of me. No, it can't happen. It shan't happen. And again, the other characteristic of these little soliloquies, as with the one that we saw in the previous video, is the ambiguity of them. This dreadful thing, it will happen. What is it that she's talking about? We're not completely sure. It could be that actually she means many possible things, and it's a measure of the deep anxiety that she feels that her ambiguous words cover many options. As an audience, as to that sort of mystery and tension, we're not sure what it is that's troubling her most. We now have the stage direction where she bolts the door of Helma's room. The maid opens the hall door for Krogstad and shuts it after him. He's wearing a fur coat, high boots, and a fur cap. In other words, winter outside weather. Outside clothing in Norway. And she advances towards him. Speak quietly, my husband is at home. I don't care about that. What do you want of me? An explanation of something. Hurry up then, what is it? Krogstad replies, you know, I suppose, that I have got my dismissal. I've been sacked now, of course. I couldn't prevent it, Mr. Krogstad. I fought as hard as I could on your side, but it was no good. Does your husband love you so little, then? He knows what I can expose you to, and yet he ventures... It's worth mentioning, isn't it, that early in this play, Nora boasted about the things that her husband would do for her. And Krogstad, of course, is now reminding her, in a sense, of that. But we've already seen from some of the things that Torvald has said that actually, reading between the lines, clearly there are certain things that he wouldn't do for her. If it compromises his reputation, there are things that he wouldn't do. And so, what else is worth noting there? Of course, when he talks about the exposure, once again we're talking about scandal and damage to reputation. He thinks that Torvald must not care about that, not realising, of course, that Nora hasn't managed to actually discuss it with him. Nora then says, "How can you suppose that he has any knowledge of that sort?" Krogstad replies, "I didn't suppose so at all. It would not be the least like our dear Torvald Helmer to show so much courage." Rather stinging. Nora replies, "Mr. Krogstad, a little respect for my husband, please." "Certainly, all the respect he deserves. But since you have kept the matter so carefully to yourself, I can only suppose that you have a little clearer idea than you had yesterday of what it is that you have actually done." Nora replies, "More than you could ever teach me." So we get a sense here then that now, after her conversation with Torvald, Nora clearly does now have a much more of an idea about what it is that she's done and how he would respond to any such action on her part, anything that would damage their public reputation as a couple. We get a sense of that. Notice the disgust that Krogstad has for Torvald, and the contempt that Nora also replies back to him, "More than you could ever teach me." People always think about this as being a play which exposes tensions in terms of gender relations, actually, but there's a lot of interesting things that you could say about tensions in class relations as well, and you could talk about Krogstad and Mrs. Lind, and indeed relationships with the servants. There would be interesting things that you could refer to there if that was a potential coursework topic of interest. Now, Nora continues and says, "What is it you want of me?" And Krogstad says, "Only to see how you were, Mrs. Helmer. I have been thinking about you all day long. A mere cashier, a mere pen pusher, a man like me, even he has a little of what is called feeling, you know." Note there, interestingly enough, how he echoes some of the language that Torvald himself used earlier. He's clearly aware of the contempt that people like him are met with in society. Nora replies, "Show it then. Think of my little children." And Krogstad says, "Have you and your husband thought of mine? But never mind about that. I only wanted to tell you that you need not take this matter too seriously. In the first place, there will be no accusation made on my part." And Nora rather complacently says, "No, of course not. I was sure of that. The whole thing can be arranged amicably. There is no reason why anyone should know anything about it. It will remain a secret between us three." Nora replies, "My husband must never get to know anything about it." Krogstad asks, "How will you be able to prevent it? Am I to understand that you can pay the balance that is owing?" "No, not just at present. Or perhaps that you have some expedient for raising the money soon?" "No expedient that I mean to make use of." There is therefore perhaps just in this section the implication that Krogstad is implying that he would be content with some kind of bribery or payoff. It's as if, having lost his job, he's now sort of desperately moving on to the next possible option to guarantee his financial security. But again, it is not completely clear. We continue. Krogstad replies, "Well, in any case, it would have been of no use to you now. If you stood there with ever so much money in your hand, I would never part with your bond." Nora says, "Tell me what purpose you mean to put it to." And Krogstad says, "I shall only preserve it, keep it in my possession. No one who is not concerned in the matter shall have the slightest hint of it, so that if the thought of it has driven you to any desperate resolution—" Nora replies, "If it has. If you had it in your mind to run away from your home, I had, or even something worse." "How could you know that?" "Give up the idea." "How did you know I had thought of that?" Krogstad says, "Most of us think that at first. I did too, but I hadn't the courage." And Nora faintly replies, "Nor had I." And now we start to see something rather sad in all this, the fact that, of course, in a sense, Krogstad does understand her suffering, because it is something that he has experienced himself. He has been someone touched by a scandal in the past. And it's not completely clear, again, I think. Does he mean now that he's going to keep the bond because it will always be something that he has on them as evidence? It will always be something that he can exploit for blackmail? Or, alternatively, is it a glimmer of sympathy? Does he perhaps realise that he hasn't the heart to destroy her life after all? It's not quite clear. It's also interesting when Krogstad talks about what he didn't do, he didn't have the courage to run away, didn't have the courage to, and by implication, kill himself. It's interesting that in Nora's response, nor had I, it's interesting that she's clearly thought about it. And so when we mentioned about those couple of very short, very frantic soliloquies that she has, I think perhaps then we're now meant to interpret that maybe that's what she was thinking about. Was she thinking about the prospect of running away or even suicide? Perhaps that was what was causing her such anxiety. Anyway, Krogstad then, in a tone of relief, says, "No, that's it, isn't it? You hadn't the courage either?" "No, I haven't. He replies, "Besides, it would have been a very foolish thing. Once the first storm at home is over, I have a letter for your husband in my pocket." Nora says, "Telling him everything?" "In as lenient a manner as I possibly could." Nora replies, "He mustn't get the letter. Tear it up. I'll find some means of getting money." And so, again, the sympathy, I think, that we increasingly see for Krogstad. I suppose it's important for this play that we don't see him simply as an antagonist. He's not simply a shady man who turns up demanding money, but a human character with a kind of real sad, pathetic, sympathy-inducing backstory, and we're meant to sympathise with his plight too. So, he's written to Torvald, telling him of this loan. Nora tries once again to persuade him to hold off, but it's not going to work. Krogstad says, "Excuse me, Mrs. Helmer, but I think I told you just now." And Nora replies, "I'm not speaking of what I owe you. Tell me what sum you are asking my husband for, and I will get the money." Krogstad says, "I'm not asking your husband for a penny." She replies, "What do you want then?" And we find out, "I will tell you. I want to rehabilitate myself, Mrs. Helmer. I want to get on, and in that your husband must help me." Now, this then is the important thing. If we're continuing to see him as a sympathetic character, we find out that he is no longer motivated by money. He's motivated by his own reputation. He wants to be rehabilitated in society, in the eyes of the world, and therefore that is what now he wants her help with, and Torvald's help with. He doesn't want money from them. He wants Torvald to help him to be respectable again. It increases our sympathy because we learn that he's not materialistic, and even though arguably reputation is a prideful thing, it's not something that is mere currencies for buying and selling. So, he continues, "For the last year and a half I have not had a hand in anything dishonourable, and all that time I have been struggling in most restricted circumstances, i.e. poverty. I was content to work my way up step by step. Now I am turned out, and I am not going to be satisfied with merely being taken into favour again. I want to get on, I tell you. I want to get into the bank again, in a higher position. Your husband must make a place for me." Poor Krogstad. All his efforts, all his desperate claw by claw, inch by inch attempts to restore his reputation, now destroyed, thanks to them getting the job from Mrs. Lind, thanks to Nora's inability to tell Torvald about what is going on, but nonetheless he's desperately trying to secure his place. Nora, though, knowing that Torvald is such a prig, such a stuck-up individual, that he will never consider accepting Krogstad's offer, replies that he will never do. And Krogstad says, "He will. I know him. He dare not protest. And as soon as I'm in there with him, then you will see." Because, of course, what Krogstad realises here, and I suppose what we as an audience have come to see, is that Torvald, whatever his other principles may be, there's also a streak of cowardice in him, cowardice about his reputation. And so I think Krogstad, having said that he knew him, or rather Torvald saying that he knew him as a younger man, Krogstad realises that weakness in Torvald and thinks that that's going to be what gets him what he wants. So he continues, "Within a year I shall be the manager's right hand. It will be Niels Krogstad and not Torvald Helmer who manages the bank." Nora says, "That's a thing you will never see." Krogstad says, "Do you mean that you will?" Nora says, "I have courage enough for it now." "Oh, you can't frighten me, a fine, spoilt woman like you." Now, it's worth noting, again, we mentioned at the start of, when Krogstad first started speaking in this section, how he talks about Nora once again in the kind of the trivial terms that we first met her. And again, when he refers to her here as a fine, spoilt woman, I think that that is playing into our first perceptions of her as a character. Now, I'm not going to try and argue that Nora is some kind of perfect heroine, but what we have seen is that she's certainly not just a fine, spoilt woman. She does have the resources. She has greater strength than just that. So, what else then? Nora says, "You will see, you will see." And Krogstad says, "Under the ice, perhaps, down into the cold, cold black water, and then in the spring to float up to the surface, all horrible and unrecognisable, with your hair fallen out." He's talking about Nora's potential suicide by drowning. This really genuinely grim image, and it's one that Nora actually will return to earlier in the play. He's trying to frighten her, clearly. Yeah, I think he thinks that Nora's suggesting that she might somehow save Torvald by sacrificing herself. It doesn't really work. Nora says, "You can't frighten me." And he replies, "Nor you me. People don't do such things, Mrs. Helmer. Besides, what use would it be? I should have him completely in my power all the same." In other words, he could still blackmail Torvald even if Nora were dead and out of the picture. And Nora says, "Afterwards, when I am no longer..." Krogstad says, "Have you forgotten if that it is I who have the keeping of your reputation, i.e. because of this loan, this fraud, this forgery, that he has the ability to destroy Nora?" Nora stands speechlessly looking at him, and he says, "Well now, I have warned you. Don't do anything foolish. When Helmer has had my letter, I shall expect a message from him, and be sure you remember that it is your husband himself who has forced me into such ways as this again. I will never forgive him for that. Goodbye, Mrs. Helmer." And he exits through the hall. Now, it's worth finally then there mentioning, interesting, that he considers that it is Nora who is forcing him to be so deceitful, because it was Nora encouraging Torvald to give Mrs. Lind a job, and therefore causing him to lose his. He sees it as being ultimately all stemming from her actions, and now from her unwillingness or inability to go back on that. But I suppose there is some justice in this. Again, it's important, I think, for this play that we don't just see him as a straight antagonist. He's not just a villain. He is, in a sense, and it's a line I've used before, but he is, in a sense, just as much a victim of society as she is. He is a member of he's a member of the lower middle class. He's more precarious than they are. She is a woman. In a sense, they both share that sense of being marginalised by society. Now, structurally, at the start of this section, I said that the usual thing in these plays is that you have the sort of the complication or the conflict in the middle, which in this case continues to be between Nora and Krogstad. At this point, this is still teetering in the balance, but it seems like it's going to lead to disaster. If the play continued on this kind of footing, we would be looking at a tragic ending. We'd be looking at the death, perhaps, of one or more of the characters. And that would seem to be what this is offering. So it's still teetering in the balance, we're still in the middle, and we don't yet know how this will resolve itself. However, as I think I also said in those notes on form, one of the interesting things about Ibsen at this time is that he's subverting, he's breaking out of those 19th century conventions of the well-made play. And so instead of simply looking for resolution, this play will lead us towards an ending that is much more ambiguous, for reasons which I think we'll see more near the time. But because Ibsen is exploring these very serious social issues, he doesn't just want a neat ending. He doesn't want something that's going to be convenient. He wants us to go away questioning, not to be going away satisfied. Now, on that note, we'll leave that there as Krogstad exits through the hall, and then in the final video for this act, which will be the next one, we'll cover the aftermath of this conversation as Nora grapples with whether or not she can resolve this situation.